At midnight, while the New York Stock Exchange slept, $4.2 trillion quietly shifted hands. Not in the shadows of back-alley deals, but right in the open market. No alarms went off, no headlines flashed. But by morning, the heartbeat of Wall Street had changed. When traders logged into their screens at dawn, they saw a name dominating the shareholder list of Goldman Sachs, one of America's most storied investment banks, the Canada Pension Plan. Investment Board. Goldman CEO David Solomon sat on the 43rd floor of the firm's Manhattan headquarters, staring at a report that refused to change no matter how many times he read it. CPPIB had acquired 12.7% of Goldman Sachs overnight. It wasn't just a stake, it was power, it was influence, and for many, it felt like control. How is this possible? Solomon demanded during an emergency meeting. His CFO, Dennis Coleman, had no answer. At least none that would comfort him. Canada had done nothing illegal. Over months, through carefully orchestrated purchases, it had quietly built a position large enough to shake the very core of Wall Street. And Goldman wasn't alone. At J.P. Morgan Chase, at Morgan Stanley, at Bank of America, the same realization dawned in boardrooms. Canadian pension funds had struck, and behind the strategy was a familiar name in global finance. Mark Carney. The architect of a silent revolution, Carney, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, had built a reputation as one of the most influential central bankers of his generation. But while America's attention was consumed by trade wars, tariffs, and political drama, Carney was crafting something else, a financial endgame. His idea was simple but devastatingly effective. Instead of fighting American economic power head-on, why not buy America from within? Carney knew Canada had a weapon few fully appreciated, its colossal pension funds. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, CPPIB, the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, OTPP, and Quebec's Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, CDPQ. Together, they managed more than $4.2 trillion, a sum larger than the GDP of Germany. These weren't just retirement funds. They were global financial juggernauts, capable of reshaping markets from London to Hong Kong. Carney understood that in modern capitalism, real power doesn't rest with managers. It rests with owners, the shareholders, the ones who can steer, corporate boards with a single vote. And now, Canadians were quietly becoming the owners of America's largest financial institutions. Goldman Sachs. The first domino for 6 months, CPPIB had been accumulating Goldman Sachs shares in near-invisible increments. Purchases spread across exchanges, different brokers, different dates, no single trade large enough to trigger alarms. When the final tally came in, Canada's funds held more than 12%, a controlling voice in board decisions. At Goldman's next board meeting, the Canadian representative wasn't just a polite observer. He had voting rights. His first motion? To expand Goldman's footprint in Canada. The Canadian market has untapped growth potential, he told the room. We should invest more aggressively here. What sounded like an ordinary proposal carried deeper weight. By embedding Goldman deeper into Canadian markets, Canada was weaving dependence, binding America's crown jewel of finance more tightly to its northern neighbor's economy. J.P. Morgan Chase, the unstoppable force. If Goldman was the first domino, J.P. Morgan Chase was the prize jewel. CEO Jamie Dimon had weathered financial storms for decades, from the Great Recession to global crises. Yet even he was powerless against CPPIB's accumulation strategy. By the time anyone noticed, Canada had secured a meaningful slice of J.P. Morgan. 2. At Dimon's next board meeting, the Canadian voice was clear. We should explore fintech partnerships with Toronto. Canada's digital banking sector is surging. Collaboration will be mutually beneficial. Dimon couldn't object. On paper, it made sense. Toronto had become a North American hub for financial technology. But to Carney, every partnership wasn't just mutually beneficial, it was strategically binding, another strand of Canada's web tightening around Wall Street's giants. Morgan Stanley, ESG as a weapon. Morgan Stanley was the third move. With 8.3% ownership now in Canadian hands, the influence was undeniable. The Canadian directive? Push ESG, environmental, social, and governance investments. It was an area where Canada already led globally, particularly in sustainable finance. By steering Morgan Stanley to expand ESG operations in Vancouver, Canada achieved two goals at once. It drew more capital north of the border, and it cemented its role as a standard setter in the emerging global ESG marketplace. For Carney, ESG wasn't just about values, it was a lever, a way to set the rules of the financial game and make sure Canada was holding the pen, Bank of America. The biggest stake. Yet, the fourth strike was bold. Together, CPPIB and the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan captured 11.2% of Bank of America, the largest institutional ownership in its history. CEO Brian Moynihan was blunt. This is unprecedented. The Canadians weren't interested in being silent partners. Their demand was clear: open a massive new operational hub in Toronto. And so, Bank of America announced its second-largest operations center worldwide, after its Charlotte headquarters, would rise in Canada. This wasn't coincidence. It was pressure, transformed into policy. Wells Fargo. Turning weakness into control. Then came Wells Fargo. Already reeling from scandals and desperate to rebuild credibility, the bank welcomed Canadian funds as saviors. Canada is a global leader in banking stability, CEO Charlie Scharf admitted. We want to learn from their expertise. In reality, Wells Fargo wasn't just learning, it was yielding. With Canadian partners propping it up, Wells Fargo effectively handed influence to Ottawa's financial elite. Beyond banks, a financial empire. Expand's Carney's plan didn't stop at the banks. Once Wall Street's pillars were secured, the strategy rippled outward. Fintech. CPPIB took positions in PayPal, Square, and Stripe. Canadians pushed for early adoption of cryptocurrency frameworks, betting on regulation in Ottawa before Washington could act. Insurance. Canadian stakes spread into AIG, MetLife, and Prudential, tying retirement systems across borders. Asset. Management. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, the big three that control trillions in global assets, now had to listen carefully to Canadian voices advocating sustainable finance. Private equity and hedge funds, partnerships with Blackstone, KKR, Carlyle, Bridgewater, Citadel. By embedding in alternative assets, Canada wasn't just buying shares, it was buying influence over the real economy itself. The ripple effect. The results became visible almost immediately. Goldman Sachs opened a new office in Toronto's financial district. JP Morgan established a technology hub in Waterloo, home to Canada's brightest engineers. Morgan Stanley launched an ESG research center in Vancouver. Suddenly, Canadian graduates from the University of Toronto, McGill, and UBC weren't just finding jobs, they were becoming the most sought-after recruits on Wall Street. The brain drain reversed, and in Washington, the tremors reached policymakers. The Federal Reserve began monitoring Canadian market shifts more closely. Treasury Department analysts warned the stability of America's financial sector now partially depended on Canadian decision-makers. For the first time in history, Wall Street wasn't purely American, it was shared. The political fallout. Carney's genius was subtlety. Canada never appeared aggressive. It never waved flags or issued threats. It simply invested, collaborated, and positioned itself as indispensable. But the consequences were profound. When the Trump administration pushed tariffs against Canada, Wall Street's most powerful CEOs warned lawmakers, "Deterioration of relations with Canada directly impacts our business. Be careful." Lobbyists carried that message into congressional hearings. Suddenly, senators on the Banking Committee spoke more cautiously about trade disputes with Ottawa. Canada, through its pension funds, had gained not just financial leverage, but political leverage too. A regulatory Trojan horse, the influence extended beyond economics into regulation. Canadian investors quietly nudged U.S. partners toward adopting rules friendlier to Canada's framework. Banking regulations, fintech policies, ESG disclosure standards, what started in Ottawa began echoing in Washington. This created what experts call regulatory arbitrage. American firms eager to align with their Canadian shareholders began voluntarily following Canadian rules. Slowly, subtly, Wall Street's rulebook was being rewritten, not by Washington, but by Toronto. The unanswered question. By the end of this silent revolution, one fact was undeniable. $4.2 trillion had reshaped America's financial landscape without a single shot fired. Mark Carney's strategy had outmatched trade wars and tariff threats. Pension funds had proven more powerful than political decrees, and now the question lingers. Is this scenario just financial fiction, or a glimpse of what could truly happen? Because pension funds are this powerful, because global capital does move in silence, and because ownership, more than anything else, is where real power lives. So we ask you, could America escape such a situation? Could Wall Street ever untangle itself if its very heart were owned piece by a foreign power? Closing. This has been a deep dive into the hidden mechanics of global finance, the strategies, the players, and the silent revolutions happening behind the ticker tape. If you found this analysis eye-opening, subscribe for more investigations.